They say out west, some folks are born to break horses, others born to never be broken. And that afternoon in Red Hollow, one of them walked through the saloon doors like a dust storm with a name. The old doors slammed open, banging hard enough to hush the crowd mid-drink. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and cheap smoke clung thick in the air. And there she was, Sadie Mae Dawson, dragged into the center of the floor, like a wild thing meant for auction. She was a mess. Dress, torn wrists, bound behind her boots, scuffed and caked with dirt. But it was her chin that caught every eye in that room, lifted high like she dared any man to try her luck. Her hair hung in tangled waves, but her eyes were clear, storm gray, and unyielding. Old Clem Barrow, fat on beer and bitterness, climbed onto a table and waved his hat. "This one don't cook, don't curtsy, and don't keep her mouth shut," he hollered. "She called me a hog in front of my own men. I'll sell her cheap to anyone got the guts to tame her." The room howled with laughter. A blacksmith downed his ale and shouted, "That one's a wild mare. Break her and you'd be a legend." Sadie didn't blink. Her voice rang out like a gunshot. "You're the one who couldn't teach a dog to sit, let alone a woman to bow." The silence hit fast. Then Clem slapped her hard across the face. She hit the ground with a thud, dust curling around her like ghost smoke. But she didn't cry. She just wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her sleeve and stood. From the shadows, a man rose slowly, one leg stiff in a leather brace, a cane in hand, shoulders broad beneath a faded coat. Jedediah McGraw, once a horseman of the Shoshone trails, now the quiet owner of a broken ranch on the ridge. He didn't say much, just stepped forward and said, "How much?" Clem sneered. "You gonna buy her, old cripple? She'll set your beans on fire before she ever boils them." Jed didn't flinch. He tossed a pouch onto the table. Silver clinked against wood. "I ain't looking for tame. I'm looking for fire." From the back door, boots echoed slow and steady. A lawman's badge caught the lantern light. Sheriff Boone Harlan, half retired, but still feared. He glanced at the girl, then at Jed. "You sure, son?" Jed nodded. Boone gave a single grunt. "Then don't you dare try to smother what you just pulled out of that fire." Sadie didn't smile, but her eyes. They met Jed's steady and measuring. No thanks. No need. Just a girl who'd been burned too long finally seeing someone who wouldn't flinch from the heat. They walked out into the cooling dusk together. And for the first time in years, Red Hollow didn't know what to say. The wagon creaked along the trail as twilight wrapped the hills in soft lavender. Sadie Mae Dawson sat upright beside Jedediah McGraw, arms folded tight, lips drawn into a hard line. Though no longer bound, she carried the weight of humiliation like dust on her skin. She hadn't said a word since they left Red Hollow. And Jed didn't ask for one. His ranch sat against the western rise, a scatter of scrubland corral fencing, and a barn sagging like an old man's shoulders. The cabin was small, patched in places with care and whatever wood he'd had on hand after the fire that gutted the north side during the winter of '81. A chimney coughed smoke into the fading light, and somewhere inside a kettle began to hiss. He stopped the team and climbed down slow, leaning into the ache of his right leg. He offered her a hand. She stared at it like it was a snake, then jumped down herself. Jed didn't take offense, just nodded and limped toward the cabin. Inside it smelled of a cedar smoke, sweat, and old leather. He pointed toward the loft ladder. "Clean bed. Towels by the basin," he said. Then he left her alone with her silence. That night, Sadie lay stiff on the mattress, hands behind her head, listening to the horses shift in the barn, the wind pick at the shutters. She didn't cry. Not anymore. But something about the quiet made her feel unsafe in a way fists never did. She was used to noise, to threat, to always watching. This silence was too soft, too kind. Before dawn, she was up, sweeping the porch, drawing water, starting the fire. No one told her to. But she wasn't about to leave dishes in a stranger's sink. When Jed stepped out, dragging his bad leg toward the barn, she was already boiling coffee and scrubbing down an old saddle. He paused, took in the sight, then dropped something on the porch rail. Leather gloves, worn but clean, small enough for her hands. "Don't act like you stole something," he said, voice low. "Work like you belong." She didn't answer, but her fingers slipped into the gloves. Days passed. She rode the fence lines, checked the troughs, patched what needed patching. Jed watched her from the porch, always quiet. She didn't mind. She liked that he didn't hover. When she brought him coffee one evening, he blinked, surprised. "You paid for me," she said when he looked at her. Jed's jaw tightened. "I paid to get you out of that saloon, not to own you. Same thing to most men. Not to me." Silence again, but not the cold kind. One morning, as the sun yawned over the ridge, Sadie knelt beneath the porch steps, dirt on her arms, planting something. When Jed limped around the corner with a bale of hay, he stopped. "You planting potatoes down there?" "Nope," she said, brushing her cheek. "Lavender, and forget-me-nots if they take." He cocked a brow. "Didn't take you for the flower type." "I ain't," she said, pressing dirt down firm. "But my mama was. Said every bloom was a letter from the earth." Jed said nothing. But later that night she found a bundle wrapped in linen on the table seeds, old and yellowed. His mother's. "Why give 'em to me?" she asked. "Because maybe this house is finally ready for something that grows." She pressed the packet to her chest. Didn't cry. Not yet. But something had started to take root between cracked earth and two people who'd been told all their lives they were too much, too wild, too broken. Out here under the wide Wyoming sky, maybe wild things were just things no one had ever loved right. And maybe that was about to change. The wind rolled in from the south that morning, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and something older like memory. Sadie Mae Dawson rode the fence line with Jedediah's old trail hat pulled low over her eyes. She sat tall in the saddle boots, dusty spine straight as a rifle barrel. No one had told her to check the posts or count heads on the cattle, but she did it anyway. That's how she knew she belonged when no one had to ask. Jed sat on the porch cane, resting across his lap, eyes following her every move. He never interrupted, just noticed. One late afternoon, as the sun bled out behind the ridge, Sadie heard the sound, a dull thump, then a grunt. She turned to see Jed sprawled near the trough leg, twisted under him, cane lying useless a few feet away. She was off her horse before she thought twice. "Don't move." "I'm not going anywhere," he muttered, jaw clenched. She slipped an arm under his shoulder, the other around his ribs. He was heavier than he looked, solid like old pine. Her chest pressed to his back as she half dragged him toward the porch, breath shallow from the strain, and something she didn't want to name. When they reached the steps, his leg knocked the bench edge, and he cursed low. She looked up, guilt flickering across her face. "Sorry, not broken," he rasped. "Just bruised pride." She turned and walked inside without another word. Behind her, he chuckled, a quiet sound full of surprise. Cute, he thought. And until that moment, he'd never once thought of Sadie that way. The next morning, she found a note by her plate. 4 words written firm. "Sadie North Fence needs mending." He didn't call her girl, not ma'am, just her name. She touched the paper once before slipping it into her apron. That evening, they sat by the fire, tin cups of coffee, warm in their hands. Neither said much until she spoke, voice like gravel over water. "My folks were killed when I was 8, she said. "Saw it all. Men came for water, my father let 'em in. They took more than that." Jed didn't flinch. He listened. "They burned the house. Took what they pleased. I hid under the floorboards till a stable hand found me days later. Thought I was a boy at first. Didn't matter. I learned to fight before I learned to spell." She stared into the flames, eyes dry but fierce. "I decided that year no one would ever break me again." Jed's voice was low. "They didn't. No. But I've been alone ever since. Even when I wasn't." He met her gaze, steady and warm. "Maybe you ain't alone now." She didn't smile. But something in her posture softened. Days passed. Sadie planted flowers beneath the porch, lavender, forget-me-nots, daisies. Jed teased her gently. "Didn't figure you for the planting type." She shrugged. "Flowers grow even on stone if the ground don't spit 'em out." That night he left a packet of old seeds on the table. His mother's. Labeled in fading ink, Spring Hope. When she asked why, he said simply, "Because maybe this land was waiting on someone who knew what hope looked like." She didn't cry, but her hands curled around that packet like it was the only thing keeping her upright. And outside in the cold dark, something had begun to bloom, slow, stubborn, and silent. Not love, not yet, but the kind of stillness a soul needs when it's spent too many years learning how not to hope. The air shifted one morning sharp with dust and something unfamiliar. Sadie stood near the barn, saddle in hand, when she saw a figure on horseback crest the ridge. The man wore a gray suit too fine for ranchland boots, polished face, clean-shaven, like he hadn't earned a callus in years. He dismounted with the ease of entitlement and walked straight for the porch, satchel in hand. Jed came from the barn, cane in one hand, jaw tight. The stranger nodded with a snake-oil smile. "Jedediah McGraw," Jed nodded once. "Who's asking?" "Thomas Whitfield. I'm with First Land and Title Bank out of Cheyenne. Just need to verify some inconsistencies on your deed." Sadie stepped onto the porch, towel in hand. She didn't speak, but her eyes locked on Whitfield, like a hawk sizing up a rabbit. He unfolded a paper, smooth and slow. "Clerical issue likely, but I'll need your signature on this to clear the file." Sadie held out her hand. "Mind if I take a look?" Whitfield blinked. "Bank business, miss?" "I can read," she replied flatly. "And I've seen these before." She studied the page, brow furrowed. "This clause here hidden in the legalese. If Jed signs, he forfeits the land in 60 days, unless he repays a loan he never took." Jed's knuckles whitened on the cane. "You trying to steal my ranch?" Whitfield's voice tightened. "This is routine procedure." But before he could say more, another horse came down the trail. Slower, dustier. The man atop it wore no suit, just a worn duster, Stetson low. On his vest gleamed a tarnished star. "Sheriff Boone Harlan." He rode up easy, slid off his horse like he had all day. "Afternoon," he said, nodding to all but staring straight at Whitfield. Sadie stepped back slightly. She had no reason not to trust Boone, but trust didn't come easy. Boone touched the brim of his hat. "Funny thing, Thomas Whitfield. First Land and Title don't use that letterhead anymore. Changed 3 years ago after that merger with Union Trust." Whitfield stiffened. Boone stepped closer. "So either you're behind on your memos, or you're behind bars." Whitfield's face cracked. He gathered his satchel in a rush. "This won't end well for you," he hissed, mounting fast. Boone just watched him go, eyes squinting after the trail of dust. Probably should have tried the next ranch over. The McGraw place bites back. Sadie exhaled slow. Jed said nothing, just looked at Boone like a man seeing something he hadn't known was watching all along. Boone turned to Sadie. "You read him like a banker." She shrugged. "Worked books at a ranch that lost everything to men like him." Boone nodded, then looked to Jed. You keep this one, son. She's sharper than your fence wire and worth more than your herd. He tipped his hat and mounted again. And if you two ever need trouble cleared the legal way, you know where I sit. As Boone disappeared into the horizon, Sadie turned to Jed. You didn't tell him I wasn't yours. Jed looked at her, eyes quiet. Didn't feel like lying. They stood a while longer on that porch, the wind teasing her hair, his fingers brushing hers for the first time. And for once, the world didn't feel like it was taking something. It felt like it was given back. By late spring, Wildflower Ridge had begun to earn its name. The garden behind the cabin no longer lay bare. Where once weeds curled around forgotten tools, now lavender stretched toward the light. Forget-me-nots scattered like sky across the dirt, and daisies stood proud despite the rocky soil. Sadie planted every inch herself, bare-handed, sleeves rolled jaw set. And Jedediah, he watched her from the porch like a man seeing color after a lifetime of gray. Each morning she rode the fence-line boots, dusty braid swinging against her back. She fixed what needed fixing, watered what needed life, and never once waited to be told. By midday, she'd be back with a tally of feed, a bundle of broken wire, and questions about the hay rotation. Jed answered what he could, but mostly he just listened, because that was what she needed. Not a master, just a place to stand still. One evening, after supper and coffee that didn't taste quite so bitter anymore, Sadie reached for the ranch ledger. She traced the columns slow and sure, then muttered, "You're 6 sacks short on grain." Jed raised an eyebrow. "You sound like a banker. Maybe in another life," she said. "One where I had shoes that matched." He chuckled. "You're sharp with numbers, more useful than 10 ranch hands I've known." She looked down, then back up. "Used to be nobody let me stay long enough to use it. Said I was too loud, too wild, too much." Jed leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're not too much, Sadie. You're just more than they could handle." She didn't answer right away, but something in her expression shifted like a gate being unlatched, not thrown open, but ready now maybe to swing with the right wind. That weekend, Boone Harlan rode up with a crate of old law books and a sack of coffee beans slung behind his saddle. He said little as usual, but sat long on the porch with Jed while Sadie worked the back fence. "She's settling in," Boone said finally. Jed nodded. "She don't trust it yet. She's smart not to." Boone replied, voice like gravel. "But she ain't running. That's something." They sat a while longer. Then Boone said something low, meant more for the wind than for Jed. "You got a house full of soil now. Best you make it worth the flowers she's plantin'." That night, Sadie found a bundle waiting on the table, leather gloves, stitched new. Her name was burned into the lining. She picked them up slow, held them to her chest, like they were something breakable. "I ain't leavin'," she said softly, more to herself than anyone. From his chair by the fire, Jed just murmured, "Didn't reckon you were." And when she looked up at him for the first time, her eyes didn't just hold fire, they held home. Outside, the wind curled through the wildflowers like a whisper. Inside, the silence between them felt less like a pause and more like a promise. The morning sky hung low, gray and heavy, with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Dew clung to the grass like small pearls, and the air carried the scent of thawed earth and wood smoke. Sadie Mae Dawson walked across the pasture, slow, her satchel slung over one shoulder, boots damp from the mist. Behind her, the cabin still smoked gently from the chimney. The porch, where she'd planted her first flowers, stood empty. She'd left a note, folded neat beside Jedediah McGraw's coffee mug. "Thank you for letting me survive." No tear stains. No dramatic goodbye. Just 4 words from a woman who never expected anything more than a place to rest her bones and be left alone. She didn't cry as she walked. But each step felt heavier than the last, even though she told herself it was time to go, that she'd done her part. Her heart had begun to root in soil she never thought would hold her. And roots don't rip free without bleeding. Down by the shallow creek, where the ridge dipped low and the water moved slow, she sat on a flat stone. Her hands rested in her lap, still and worn. She stared at the current, unsure whether she was breathing or holding her breath. Then hooves. She heard them before she saw him. Jed appeared at the crest, backlit by a pale sun, struggling through cloud. He dismounted with a wince, favoring his bad leg. Then he just stood there for a long while, like he was afraid even one wrong word might send her further away. Sadie didn't look up. "You left before breakfast," he said quietly. She shrugged. "Didn't figure it was mine to stay for." His boots crunched down the slope. "You think I brought you here to boil coffee and mend fences?" "I think," she said, "most folks take what they're given." "I didn't want to mistake a warm place for something that lasts." He didn't speak, just reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, folded linen, old and soft. "I found this under the stairs," he said, holding it out. "You left it the first day. Could have tossed it." "Didn't." Sadie blinked. It was her mother's handkerchief, the one with the tiny blue flowers stitched into the corner. The only thing she'd carried through every place, every pain, every night too dark to breathe through. "You kept it," Jed nodded, "because I figured one day you might need reminding that you belonged here." Her throat tightened. She took the cloth, pressing it to her chest like armor. Her voice cracked. "I ain't someone men keep." He stepped closer. "You're not meant to be kept. You're meant to be chosen. There's a difference." For a long moment they just stood there, water whispering, wind teasing at her braid. Then without a word she placed her hand in his. Rough on rough. Two people who'd bled enough to know softness when it found them. He didn't grip tight, just held, steady, like you would with a wild colt or something holy. The sun broke through, faint but certain, and in that gold light beside the creek and the scars they no longer hid, Sadie Mae Dawson stopped surviving and started to live. By summer, Wildflower Ridge was no longer just a stretch of stubborn land with a weathered barn and a sagging porch. It had become a place where color returned. The pasture ran wide and golden, dotted with cattle moving slow in the heat. The garden behind the house overflowed. Lavender swayed in waves. Daisies turned their faces to the sun, and forget-me-nots crept along the fence like sky stitched into soil. Sadie Mae Dawson rode the line every morning, Jedediah's old trail hat shading her face, braid swinging behind her. Her hands were calloused, now boots, worn shoulders straight as fence posts. The boys in town started calling her Miss Tess, shortened in that easy way Western folk give respect without saying much. Some whispered she rode better than any man. No one dared test the claim. She patched breaks in the wire-pulled calves from thorn tangles, barked orders when needed. By noon, she'd return with dust on her cheekbones and a glint in her eye. She didn't help Jed anymore. She ran the place with him. They never made announcements. There was no ring, no preacher, no names carved in wood. Just the way her hand brushed his at the general store, the way he passed her the branding iron. Without a word, the way she poured 2 coffees every morning like it had always been that way. On one warm evening, just as the sun dipped low like a copper coin, Jed saddled his horse and whistled. Sadie stepped out of the barn, arms crossed. "You running off somewhere? Only if you're coming too." She raised a brow. "Where we headed? You'll see." They rode side by side, hooves soft on the trail. The breeze stirred warm, carrying the smell of sweet grass and distant rain. The trail wound past the southern ridge, half-barren land where nothing much grew. Until this year, until Sadie scattered seed there with her bare hands, muttering something about stubborn soil needing beauty, too. Now, in the dying light, the hill blazed with wildflowers. They swayed tall in full colors, bursting from cracks in the rock like a promise kept. Jed tied his horse. Sadie followed him up the slope, boots brushing petals. At the top, they stood in silence. The ranch lay below them, golden and small beneath the sky. Sadie folded her arms. "You said you had a reason for dragging me up here." Jed nodded. "You said once flowers grow on stone." Got me thinking. Maybe love does too. She didn't answer. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. Jed reached into his coat, pulled out a worn strip of leather, his first horse rein bent and smoothed by time. Burned into the center, the letter S. "Ain't got a ring," he said. "Didn't think I'd need one. But this has followed me longer than anyone. Through storms, through war, through burnin', and I figure I want it to follow you now." He held it out, calm as always. Sadie stared at the leather. Her throat worked once, then again. No tears fell, but her fingers shook as she looped it gently around her wrist. "You didn't try to tame me," she whispered. "No," Jed said. "You ain't a thing to tame. You just stood beside me." "That's the only way I know how," he said. They stood together as the last of the light slipped behind the ridge. No vows, no audience, just wind, and two souls that had stopped running. The days rolled on like soft thunder, slow, warm, and steady. Out at Wildflower Ridge, things didn't need to be said out loud. They simply were. Sadie Mae kept the ranch ledger. Now sleeves rolled to her elbows, pencil behind her ear. Eyes narrowed in that way that meant she was doing math no one else around here could quite follow. Repairs, feed grain storage, barter rates in Cheyenne. She logged it all. Her handwriting was sharp, steady, sure. Across the table, Jedediah McGraw traced symbols burned into a branding guide, old marks from ranches long gone. He tapped one. "This one's Bar T," he said. "Belonged to a family down near Casper. Ranch folded after the drought of '83. Sadie leaned in. "Looks like a hammer and nail," he chuckled. "A brand tells a story. Everyone. Some honest, some bitter." She looked up. "What's ours say?" Jed held her gaze quiet, then pointed to the mark they'd burned together weeks ago. A wildflower looped through the letter M. "Means we made something out of nothing," he said. She didn't smile, but her fingers lingered on the page. That evening, as she shoveled hay behind the barn, Sheriff Boone Harlan rode up, slow dust trailing behind him. He didn't dismount, just watched a moment before tipping his hat. "Ranch looks better than last time." Sadie leaned on the pitchfork. "We ain't aiming for pretty, just sturdy." Boone nodded. "Looks like you got both." He pulled something from his saddlebag, a folded piece of parchment. "Territories redrawing district lines next month. Folks in Cheyenne asking which ranches count." She raised an eyebrow. "And ours," Boone smiled. "Already submitted. Listed under Wildflower Ridge." She blinked. "That official?" "It is now." With that, he turned his horse and rode off. Dust curled around his wake like a signature in the air. That night by the fire, Sadie opened the parcel he'd left the official stamp of the registry office sealed and dated. The land was theirs. Not borrowed. Not hidden under some man's name. Theirs. She stared at the paper, then at Jed. Her voice was low, almost unsure. "You really put that name down?" He sipped his coffee. Didn't seem right to call it anything else. Later, as lanterns cast gold across the kitchen walls, Sadie watched him silently. His broad hands, his furrowed brow, the way he turned the firewood just so. She spoke without looking. "You ever think all this would happen?" Jed shook his head. "Didn't think I'd last another winter, let alone find someone who'd ride beside me instead of away." She stood, walked over, placed her hand flat on his chest right over the old burn scar where his past had nearly taken him. "Well," she said, "I'm still here." He covered her hand with his, said nothing, but his silence held more than any vow ever could. Outside wind whispered through the fields. The wildflowers leaned into the dark unafraid. And inside, in that plain wooden house beneath Wyoming sky, love grew quiet, stubborn, and full of root. Not the kind you announce, the kind you build.